Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on a rainy day to Ream Library. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center, as many of you know, sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, and conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. A core part of our mission is to foster greater understanding, Jewish-Christian understanding, through two initiatives: the Kraft-Hiatt Program for Jewish-Christian Understanding, which brings us here today, and Readings from the Roots, which helps clergy and churches nationwide to think about how the scripture they use on Sundays could avoid anti-Jewish biases in translation and in preaching. For many years now, 15 or more, we were counting at lunch, we've been fortunate to host Alan Rosen, a renowned scholar of Holocaust literature, in a role that we eventually designated as the Kraft-Hiatt Scholar in Residence. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Rosen back to Holy Cross. I've heard over the years many times from students about the profound impact he's had upon them. Alan Rosen has long served as a lecturer at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, and he's held fellowships at the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah in Paris, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He's the author of several books, many of which he has discussed during his visits. The most recent, The Holocaust Jewish Calendars, Keeping Time Sacred, Making Time Holy, was awarded the 2020 Yad Vashem International Book Prize. He shared that work with us as it was developing in a lecture here in 2011, a long time ago. Most germane to today's lecture, Alan was a student of the late Elie Wiesel, the renowned writer, Holocaust survivor, and Nobel Peace Prize winner. He is the editor of several collections that publish and reflect on Wiesel's work, including most recently, Filled with Fire and Light in 2021. Alan consults with the Wiesel Foundation and also serves as project director for the Wiesel Living Archive at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. Today he's speaking on Elie Wiesel's legacy and the concept of celebration as a key term in Wiesel's life and work. So please join me in welcoming Alan Rosen.
I quote my teacher, mentor, Elie Wiesel. A Hasidic legend tells us that the great Rabbi Baal Shem Tov, master of the good name, also known as the Besht, undertook an urgent and perilous mission to hasten the coming of the Messiah. For having tried to meddle with history, the Besht, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, was punished, banished along with his faithful servant to a distant island. In despair, the servant implored his master to exercise his mysterious powers in order to bring them both home. Impossible, the Besht replied. My powers have been taken from me. Suddenly the master turned to his servant, his student, and asked, "Remind me of a prayer, any prayer. If only I could," said the servant. "I too have forgotten everything." Everything? Absolutely everything? Yes, except what? Except the aleph base, the alphabet, Hebrew alphabet. At that, the Besht cried out joyfully, "Then what are you waiting for? Begin reciting the alphabet, and I'll repeat after you." And together the two exiled men began to recite, at first in whispers, Then more loudly, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, A, B, C, D, and over again, each time more vigorously, more fervently, until ultimately the Besht regained his powers, having regained his memory. End of quote. This story opens Elie Wiesel's 1986 Nobel lecture. He was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, and one of the obligations of that August award is to give a speech and to give a lecture. So this opened the lecture. But he first put this story in print some years earlier, at the beginning of his path-breaking volume entitled Souls on Fire, the initial volume of what came to be a series of portraits of Hasidic, biblical, and Talmudic personages. In its original French, remembering that my teacher, our teacher, Elie Wiesel, having grown up in Hungary, then after the war, liberated from Buchenwald concentration camp, he was sent to France for rehabilitation, spent about 10 years there, and he then took French as his literary language. So in its original French, the book Souls on Fire was entitled Célébration Chassidique, Hasidic Celebration. The title was apropos, since Hasidim, the particular movement of Jewish life, learning, and service that was launched by the Baal Shem Tov in the 18th century, Hasidim are known for making celebration an integral aspect of serving the Almighty. Yes, I do like to celebrate the movement that personifies celebration, quoting again my teacher, Elie Wiesel. And as he writes in his preface to the updated English edition of the book, in French, this book is entitled Hasidic Celebration, for it is about a celebration. What is Hasidism if not a way of celebrating that attachment of the Jew, first to his God, then to his master, then to his friends, to their common memory? Yet Hasidim and Hasidism was only a part of the reason behind the title Celebration, or celebration. Its application clearly extends beyond the borders of the Hasidic world, as witnessed by the fact that Professor Wiesel used the word celebration, celebration, as a recurring title in all his subsequent studies of Jewish tradition. Celebration of the Bible, which was published in 1975, 3 years after the first book. Celebration of Hasidism 2, 1981. Celebration of the Prophets in 1991. And celebration of the Talmud in 1998. In 1994, Professor Wiesel published in a one-volume compilation which gathered in a single volume all the celebrations issued to date. A celebration of celebrations, as it were. Even those books focused on Jewish tradition that did not explicitly bear the title belonged in essence, said Professor Wiesel, to the celebration series. And for example, there was a much heralded book titled Four Hasidic Masters and Their Struggle Against Melancholy, and 5 biblical portraits, both of which, very interestingly, were published by University of Notre Dame Press. Professor Wiesel said, those too are part of the celebration series. These compilations were also not meant to be the final word. Professor Wiesel had hoped to publish 2 other celebration volumes, one devoted to Jewish poetry and the other to Jewish mysticism. The hope to complete 7 volumes continued to the end of his life, an aspiration perhaps triggered in part by the wholeness associated in the Bible and elsewhere with that unique number 7. 7 is the Sabbath day, or as we were speaking during our luncheon meeting, 7 is also associated with the sabbatical year, where one takes farmers to this day in Israel take an entire year off during the 7th year from working and rest, or better put, devote their energies in a different direction while letting the land be unowned for a year. When I met with Professor Wiesel in fall 2015, I asked if I remembered correctly that his intention was to publish 7 volumes with the title Celebration, Celebration, information he had shared with me some years earlier. He said, yes, I had remembered correctly, and that the 2 final volumes were still in process. At the time of that meeting, in fall of 2015, Professor Wiesel was 87 years old, had published some 60 books, and was ailing. Yet his thirst for completing projects and starting new ones continued unabated. Quoting Professor Wiesel again, I should like to prolong my life by a few years, by a few months, or at least by a few moments, he wrote in his final book published during his lifetime, the memoir, Open Heart. And quoting again, for there are so many unfinished projects. The 2, end of quote, the 2 concluding volumes of the Celebration Project were among the projects that seemingly remained unfinished. So we look at a very different side of Elie Wiesel. Tonight we have the chance to reflect together Elie Wiesel in celebration. Elie Wiesel is known, which I'll come to down the road, as the chronicler par excellence of Holocaust memory. And here we see celebration becomes the title, the word, the idea, the concept that was part and parcel of his lifelong endeavor to be able to teach, to transmit, as he would say. So we want to be able to tease out what's the meaning of that for someone who was a survivor, who saw such carnage, who witnessed such evil, to make his life revolve, to pivot around celebration. How did the 2 come together? But before I want to give heartfelt thanks to my dear colleagues here, Tom Landy, who introduced me and hosted this gathering in this beautiful room with these beautiful people coming, ranging for classes with students, meetings with colleagues. It's really very, very special. And I traveled a few miles from my home in Jerusalem to be able to be here, and every mile was worth it. And thanks to his colleagues who have been so supportive over the 16 years, I think, that we've been doing this. Professor Neil Lipsitz, and with special gratitude and thanks, and may he go from strength to strength, as we say, as he plans to retire, and as in with a sabbatical year. It's really, retirement is really an occasion where one can harness their energies for bigger and better projects. I'm not saying there's anything bigger and better than this, but I'm sure Professor Lipsitz will do that, and we work in collaborating on articles, collaborating on study, and that will only give us more time to be able to do that. And he should be blessed with, we say, Ad Me'av Esrim, may he have until 120 years. We say that to each and every person because the guide of all Jews, and maybe all of the world, that for whom the Bible is pivotal, Moses, the prophet Moses, the lawgiver, lived till the age of 120. So we honor each person by saying their years should also extend. And I think under the surface it's saying they should have years with the meaningfulness, with the influence, with the effect, with the joy that Moses himself did. And Alan Avery Peck has also been a stalwart presence in our meetings, in our teaching, and as far as I know, he's not yet retiring, but for all of us, our time comes and we want to make the most of our days. And should be blessed to be able to use them in the best way. And story that I'll tell at the end, God willing, has to do that, but we have miles and miles to go before. So let's return to celebration. The mic is working okay? Yeah, good. The story the celebration titles tell is also, as we heard, a Jewish story, and a religious one at that. Indeed, the titles of Professor Wiesel's books reveal Professor Wiesel's process of devotional study, which he characterizes in the following way: to rediscover ancient texts is to celebrate them in their diversity, their timeless beauty. For Professor, end of quote. For Professor Wiesel, moreover, celebration encompasses virtually all genres of religious Jewish writing through the ages. And I quote again: prophetic, Talmudic, philosophical, poetic, ethical celebrations, end of quote. Such sweeping inclusion, mentioning in one phrase, not even a sentence, but a phrase, most of what Professor Wiesel prized, with a single exception. Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, fall, the Bible, the contents of which serve as the basis for most of the essays in Biblical Celebration, the 2nd volume in the Celebration series. It goes unmentioned. How could that be? It's very unlikely that Professor Wiesel would have overlooked it or underestimated its value. More likely, Professor Wiesel understood when he said he began with the word prophetic as a genre and spiritual level that defined the essential nature of human experience, of the human enterprise in the first books of the Torah, as well the Torah, the Bible, as well as all the subsequent ones, the prophetic books per se. Tellingly, the French compilation, Prophetic Celebrations, features essays not only on the prophetic books per se, but also on Noah, Sarah, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, premier figures in the Bible's first 5 books, as you well know, as well as essays on those who appear in the prophetic books bearing their name: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Jonah, and others. The prophets, moreover, particularly Jeremiah, had a special significance for Professor Wiesel in their role as guides through the anguish of catastrophe. Professor Wiesel concludes his characterization, and this is in his extraordinary memoir titled All Rivers Run to the Sea, the title of which is taken from the biblical book which we call Koheles, which others in the world call Ecclesiastes. All rivers run to the sea. So he substitutes another word central to his lexicon: fervor. One must, and I quote again, one must approach Jewish tradition through its fervor and with the help of its illustrious and inspired thinkers. End of quote. Professor Wiesel couples celebration with fervor to emphasize that the study of Jewish tradition, its text, its teachers, its lessons, is not an academic exercise, but rather a subjective one, whereby an intense emotional bond to Jewish tradition is a must. No armchair philosophy here. The relation between the 2 words, celebration and fervor, is reciprocal and circular. Fervor leads to celebration, and celebration leads to greater fervor. Both words recur again and again through Professor Wiesel's teachings, urging the reader or listener to settle for nothing less than the experience, celebration, fervor, the experience firsthand. In terms of book titles, it is only with the first of Professor Wiesel's books dedicated exclusively to Jewish concerns, A Celebration of Hasidism, Souls on Fire, published in 1972, that he uses that title. From then on, Celebration remains a book title reserved only for the study of Jewish tradition. Nothing else qualifies, not fiction, not essay, not autobiography, not cantati. He wrote the lyrics for 2 cantati, Anim Amin, I believe, and Song for Hope. Only the study of Jewish tradition earns the right to such a title. It should be said that this does not mean that the other books he authored, and the diverse titles they bore were any less valuable. What it does mean is that for Professor Wiesel, there existed an intimate bond between Jewish tradition, the Torah, the Bible, Talmud, Hasidism, and the idea of celebration. As he tells us, the bond is deep. Celebration of what? I'm quoting here from And the Sea is Never Full, the 2nd volume of his autobiography. Celebration of what? Of Torah, yes. Of God, yes again. End of quote. So the very fundamentals of what makes a Jew are precisely what deserve to be celebrated. Hence, to name every book that's centered on these Jewish fundamentals, celebration flowed naturally from Professor Wiesel's idea of what Judaism is and what it needs to be. All of this is true and helps to account for the fact that Professor Wiesel, known the world over for his eloquent insistence on authentic, sober, wrenching memory of the Holocaust, brought the title and thus the idea of celebration to the fore again and again. The title Night, he used once. How many have read his memoir, Night? Yes, lots. Great. The title, The Forgotten, title of one of his novels, he used once. The title Hostage, apropos during our own time, he used once. So it was with some other 50 titles. Each one was used for a single book. Only celebration made return appearances. Why celebration? Why so many times? What secret is embedded in using this title and in using it over and over again? Or perhaps there is no secret. Perhaps the meaning is quite transparent once one knows to look for it. Even before the book titles came on the scene, there were earlier intimations, earlier celebrations. In his book, The Jews of Silence, Professor Wiesel's 1966 first-hand chronicle describing the plight, the oppression, the persecution of Soviet Jews. He titled the pivotal middle chapter, Celebration in Moscow. The celebration took place on the holiday of Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, which comes on the 23rd day of the Jewish month of Tishrei, at the very end, the finale, the culmination of the fall festival season, beginning with the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. On the holiday of Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, the celebration is twofold. The Torah is concluded and immediately begun over again. And second, the Torah is venerated by way of dancing with a Torah scroll. This twofold festivity occurs all over the world. But in 1965, Moscow's Jews were generally intimidated by fear of reprisals from the, to put it mildly, unsympathetic communist authorities. Most Russian Jews did not observe holidays. The rejoicing of the Torah, that holiday, was the exception to the rule. Celebrating this holiday by dancing in the central Moscow synagogue and the streets surrounding it became a means of protesting communist oppression and affirming at the same time Jewish life and tradition. This ingenious form of protest, joining traditional celebration with political daring, clearly touched Professor Wiesel deeply, so much so that he adapts a famous Mishnaic teaching to convey the extraordinary level of celebration he participated in. And I quote from his book, The Jews of Silence, "He who has not witnessed the rejoicing of the law in Moscow has never in his life witnessed joy," which echoes the Mishnah's teaching, Mishnah being the primary compilation of Jewish law published or compiled some 2,000 years ago, approximately, which reads, "Anyone who has not seen the rejoicing of the place of the water drawing has not seen joy in his life," end of quote. Different though Moscow may be from Jerusalem, Professor Wiesel's adaptation is not far-fetched, since both focus on holidays. The Mishnah focuses on the holiday of Sukkot, the festival of booths, and as we heard, that Moscow focuses on Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah. And they both come in what's called the seasons of our joy. Though the sentiment is the same, Professor Wiesel nevertheless shifts radically the place where true joy is to be witnessed, from the ancient Jewish temple in Jerusalem to the Moscow synagogue in the shadow of the Kremlin. And in our time, Russia is not to put it mildly, a simple country, land, entity, but for those of us that had occasion to travel, not to mention live in Eastern Europe during the time of the communist grip on Russia and the Eastern European countries, we feel that trembling that is fear for one's life, well-being, one's family, one's children. So he shifts it from the optimal setting in the Jerusalem temple for scaling spiritual heights to the one that is subject to the utmost spiritual repression. But that is just the point. The celebration in Moscow in 1965 matches that in Jerusalem because the joy in Moscow breaks free of all constraints and barriers, including the life-threatening political oppression. In that respect, the celebration in Moscow, defying laws of the state as well as of nature, even exceeds, I would submit, even exceeds that of the one in Jerusalem. He thus returns, Professor Wiesel thus returns to the episode often, retelling it and drawing out its implications. Celebrations of this kind could affect thousands, but it also could be stunningly personal. Not long after he penned Celebration in Moscow, Professor Wiesel titled a diary excerpt in his book, One Generation After, published in 1970, he titled that diary excerpt Hasidic Celebration, wherein he recounts the impromptu Ofruf festivity, the Sabbath preparation that came before his own wedding in 1969, that he celebrated with toasts, food, dancing, made for him prior to that wedding, which took place some days later at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. Drawn into the celebration despite his great reserve, Professor Wiesel responds with great emotion as the festivities mark a turning point. He writes in his post-war life and healing, remembering again that he came from the concentration camps of Auschwitz and of Buchenwald as a 16-year-old, and losing his father in Buchenwald, his mother and youngest sister, grandfather, grandmother, aunts, uncles, cousins in the terrible murders of Auschwitz and elsewhere. And one generation after is that name assessing what happens a generation later, 25 years after the liberation from the camps. And Professor Wiesel made sure, I don't know exactly how he did this, but that Random House would publish on April 11th, which was exactly the day of liberation from Buchenwald, meaning it was geared to be a response, a commentary, a going forward from that time built on the ruins, and as he says elsewhere, built with the ruins of the Holocaust. Surprisingly, the celebration in Moscow, defying the authorities and occurring against all odds, took place far more easily than the one in Manhattan, where he was preparing for his own wedding. For Professor Wiesel to rejoice was a struggle. The past holds him in its grip, and those around him, as he describes it, in his estimation, have unlearned the art of inviting joy and fervor. End of quote. Why didn't you say anything about getting married this week, says the rabbi. In contrast to the groom-to-be, the rabbi of the synagogue lives in the present, celebrates in the present, shows that the customs of the European continent 25 years earlier apply to another one, to the Jews of America at that time. He, the rabbi, therefore invites everyone to an improvised reception for the groom, Professor Wiesel, featuring wines, liquor, vodka. Sounds good, yes? Everything else one may expect to find at a Hasidic celebration. Despite the fact that Professor Wiesel excerpts the chronicle from his diary, he can only tell of the celebration as if it's happening to someone else. We fill the glasses, I quote, "We drink to the young man's health and future happiness," and still the young man remains silent and aloof, end of quote. Third person, that's what he can do. For those of us who, for whom Professor Wiesel's words, writings, teachings are the center of our lives. We see this move to the reticence of third person again and again. Very striking. Yet the Hasidic celebration breaks down many barriers, enabling the reticent young man, now dancing and singing like he was doing in Moscow, to experience a joy at once ancestral and personal, violent and serene, he says, a joy that announces and is part of creation, end quote. The climax of the dancing of this celebration does away with the final barrier, and I quote again, through his eyelids closed as though forever, he feels the flow of his first adult tears. Even though I could say, I have a longer section that I think I will not go into here, that just because of the detail, but the fact that Professor Wiesel excerpts this chronicle from his diary underscores the nearness and intimacy, even while it's in the third person, meaning he has both sides. Nearness, intimacy, on the one hand, bringing closeness, and distance of the third person on the other. That's what celebration does. That's what it enables. Professor Wiesel's essay, entitled A Celebration of Friendship, published in the 1980s, eventually coming out in 1990 in his book, From the Kingdom of Memory, well after the books, Celebration Hasidic, celebration of the Bible, celebration of the Talmud, well after that celebration series had been launched. This essay weaves personal experience with philosophical reflection to offer a tribute to friendship, a tribute that culminates with an appreciation of the essential role friendship has, again, in Hasidic life, where, according to Professor Wiesel, it reaches its epitome. Because Hasidic life demands a community of fellowship for both men and women to this day. Finally, Professor Wiesel titled his 2006 40th anniversary lecture at the 92nd Street Y in New York, where he had been lecturing since 1966. He entitled it, Come and Celebrate. And I quote, "The topic before us is come and celebrate. So let's celebrate." What should we celebrate? Should we celebrate the fact that at the beginning of the 21st century, 2006, freedom and solidarity still exist here and there? In many places, in our own country, surely. In Israel, certainly. Should we celebrate what we've always tried to celebrate until now for the last 40 years? The value, the attraction, the melodious inspiration of learning, and that learning has an appeal, and you are the living proof that it has an appeal. Should we celebrate that our people has never lost its thirst for knowledge and peace? Should we celebrate Israel? We always do, we always must, that Israel is strong and vibrant, that in spite of all the challenges, the threats, the dangers, the tragedies, Israel is still singing its love for the future, its love for the past, and for what we all cherish, memory. Should we celebrate the Jews in the former Soviet Union, together with other people there, are no longer oppressed, and they are not. Here, in the beginning of our encounters, we spoke about them a lot. I quoted a lot of the stories written about them and for them. Should we celebrate simply occasions that need celebration by law, by Jewish law? Purim, the holiday of Purim, is behind us as it is for us. The holiday of Passover is before us. And these are great holidays. End of quote. Wherever one turns in Professor Wiesel's writing, speaking, and doing, book titles, chapters, holidays as a form of protest, festivities accompanying life events, the singular miracle of friends and friendship, and the crowning achievement of an ongoing teaching for 40 years. One encounters celebrations. To speak of this repeated emphasis on celebration is fine. But more penetratingly, what about night? What about devotion to Holocaust memory? What about Professor Wiesel's harsh words reserved for those who author books or make movies that water down or sentimentalize the truth of what took place during the Holocaust? He wrote about this also often. In fact, last year, I spoke while speaking about the survivors among us. I spoke of Professor Wiesel's 3 essays, a plea for the dead, a plea for the survivors, and a new plea for the survivors. And this was also something that he orbited around continually, regularly, intensely. To be sure, Professor Wiesel's memoir, Night, his first book, is exceptional in its head-on depiction of what he and his family endured and of the terrible loss of his father, mother, sister, grandparents, and scores of other relatives, friends, classmates, and neighbors. Most of his other writings do not take this direct approach, but they do take account of the damage wrought. Professor Wiesel's emphasis on celebration that I've been asserting may really seem to fly in the face of his dedication to the memory of the Holocaust. But in truth, it went, to my mind, hand in hand with this commitment. How, reflected Professor Wiesel, how can I oppose death if not by celebrating life? He articulated in an interview with Richard Hefner. Every word of every lecture I would submit, celebrating study in general, study of the Torah, of the Bible, and the religious texts in particular, and the precious nature of life above all, thus served as the necessary counterpart of Professor Wiesel's unflinching loyalty to Holocaust memory. As I draw toward the final section of my paper, I can say that Professor Wiesel taught this directly in a pivotal essay published in the winter of 1973, some 51 years ago. And the title of the essay was not Celebration, was called Against Despair. The final pages of this essay may be among his most important, and certainly among the most important for understanding his passion, his fervor for celebration. The date is significant. On one level, the essay is responding to the terrible cost of what Jews in Israel call the Yom Kippur War, which was waged a few months earlier, and to the despair that in the wake of the massive losses could have taken hold. The fact that it did not can be measured, according to Professor Wiesel, in terms of celebration. And I quote, "On the eve of the holiday of Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, following the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, rabbis in America were faced with the question of whether or not their congregation should celebrate this joyful holiday." End of quote. So this now was while the war was going on. The war had broken out some 13 days before and was still being fought. Lives were still very much at stake and were being lost day by day. So could one celebrate, enjoy during this time? Was that legitimate? Was that possible? Was that to be sought? The question was sharpened by the fact that Israel had been taken by surprise and sustained heavy losses. Hence, the war was being fought as the question of celebration was being pondered. Would celebrating the holidays show insensitivity to the suffering of the Jews in Israel, as if the fate of Israel's Jews had little or no bearing on the lives of Jews in America? Or would celebrating the festival as tradition would seem to mandate support their cause by demonstrating that the enemy does not dictate the terms on which Jews lead their lives? And the answer of the rabbis in America, writes Professor Wiesel, was, and I quote, unequivocal. Yes, they should celebrate. Never mind that it wasn't easy. Never mind that they didn't feel like singing and dancing. Never mind that there were so many reasons against celebrating. We had to celebrate. And I remind us of the phrase, the teaching that Professor Wiesel brought that I cited just a few minutes ago. How can one oppose death if not by celebrating life? The rabbis in America were neither insensitive nor innovative. The decision not to yield to despair, but rather to celebrate, notes Professor Wiesel, has always been our way. He goes on to recount in his essay, Against Despair, that appeared in his book, A Jew Today. It's very much available now. He goes on to recount two wartime episodes that demonstrate how celebrating on the holiday of Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, regardless of the circumstances, has always been our way, even when setting and circumstance would point in the other direction. The first episode he cites took place in a deportation train. And you recall from your reading of Night and your general knowledge that the persecution by the Nazis often took place by taking Jews from their city, as they did with Professor Wiesel, from his city of Siget, crowding them into boxcars and sending them into occupied Poland, generally, to the concentration camps, death camps there. And so this is what he's describing on one of those cars. Suddenly, an old rabbi exclaimed, "Today is Simchas Torah. It's the holiday of the rejoicing of the Torah. Have we forgotten what Jews are ordered to do on this day?" Someone had managed to smuggle a small Torah scroll aboard the train. He handed it to the rabbi, and they began to sing, Tzaveh, 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 Tzaveh Yeshuas Yaakov. And they began to sing, to sway. Since they could not dance, there was not enough room to dance. And they went on singing and celebrating the Torah, all the while knowing that every motion of the train was bringing them closer to their end. End of quote. When reaching the horrendous end of the journey, the passion for celebration, notes Professor Wiesel, was still not quelled at the end of the journey, at the arrival in the camp. And I quote again here, in one of the barracks in the kingdom of night, several hundred Jews gathered to celebrate the holiday of Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the law. In the shadow of shadows? Yes, even there. But since there was no Torah scroll there, because when they arrived at camp, everything was taken from the Jews. Everything. One of my teachers, the Chabad rabbi in Boston, Rabbi Posner, his wife's grandfather was on one of those trains with a family Torah scroll. And when he arrived at Auschwitz and forced to get off the train, he was told he had to leave the Torah scroll in the train. He refused. And he was beaten to death for holding the Torah scroll. So that's why they didn't have Torah scrolls. But since there was no Torah scroll, how could they organize the traditional procession where one danced with Torah scrolls, paraded with Torah scrolls? An older man asked a boy, do you remember what you learned in Cheder in your religious education? Shema Yisrael? Yes? Really? You do? And the man lifted the boy, clasped him in his arms, and began dancing with the boy as though he were the Torah scroll. They all joined in. Never before had Jews celebrated Simchas Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, with such fervor, such celebration. And to conclude, it's time to return now to the Nobel lecture story that I began about the Baal Shem Tov and his servant, who was his student, whose name Professor Wiesel gives elsewhere and that we know from other sources. His name was Zvi Hirsch Soifer, and they were marooned on this island, as we heard, and bereft of the powers, the mystical powers that the Baal Shem Tov, the Besh, usually drew on to find his way out of each and every difficult circumstance. Yet they do eventually get out. They escape, however, not, as we heard, by resort to the miraculous powers that made the Baal Shem Tov famous, and that, inspired by his teachings and example, launched a spiritual revolution in his day, and that continues to invigorate in our own. It's rather the student, the servant, Zvi Hirsch Soifer, who does what is needed, who recites the Aleph Beis, the Hebrew alphabet, which is the only thing that remembers Aleph Beis, Gimel, Daled, A, B, C, D, and is thereby able to break the evil spell that has held them captive. The student is the one who remembers and saves his master. So perhaps, it seems to me, perhaps the story offers a clue to the legacy we, as Professor Wiesel's students, each and every one of us. There is no one in the world, to my mind, who is not a student of Elie Wiesel. Certainly anyone who's read Night, read his other books, heard him speak, either in person or in audio, video. There's tons available. We recall that 2 celebration volumes, which Professor Wiesel had hoped to publish, still remain uncompleted. Perhaps the task of finishing them, of bringing to completion Professor Wiesel's celebration project, is to be borne by Professor Wiesel's students. Perhaps it has been left to us to finish the project of bringing to 7, a holy number that, since the creation of the world in 7 days, is associated both with completion and with celebration. It is up to us to try to do what was left undone. And that, to my mind, is also what a master does for his students. He leaves them important things with which to spend their time, our time. Thank you.